Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Tuesday. This is Marty Kaiser with our Real Estate Tidbits Tuesday edition. Glad to be back. We took a week off and we're rip-roaring, ready to go. Also, I wanted to note, too, that we're just starting our second year of the podcast. We just celebrated recently our first year anniversary, and we've made it through the first year, so we expect bigger and better in 2025-26. We're excited to be back. So let's get started. I'm going to have my right-hand person, Shanna. She had a question from a listener, so I'll let her ask me.
Hello, Marty. A listener asked if you can explain the changes in the condominium laws in Florida.
Okay, that's a fairly involved question, Shanna. I'll do my best to answer our listener. It's not going to be one that I can answer in a couple sentences, but let me try to do my best on that. As you may or may not know, condominiums have gotten a lot of publicity over the last few years, basically in two categories. So the first category of change had to do with the tragedy we suffered in South Florida. I think that was in 2021, where those big condominium towers collapsed, and unfortunately we had people that passed away, and it was just a horrible and scary situation for everybody involved. So because of that, they enacted some significant changes in Florida. And so they basically had to deal with the following, and then I'll give you a little bit more specifics on that. And I'm going to kind of read this because I want to make sure that I get the wording correctly. In Florida, condominium buildings with 3 or more stories must undergo milestone inspections based on their age. Buildings 30 years or older, or 25 years or older for those within 3 miles of the coast, must complete their initial inspection by December 31st. Subsequent inspections are required every 10 years. So what does that mean exactly? Well, basically, there's 2 categories of where these new laws are going to pertain. If your condominium building was 3 stories or more, and it was in 3 miles of the coast, they had to have their initial inspection actually in December, by the end of December of 2024. So obviously we're in Central Florida, so that type of inspection is really not going to be required yet. But obviously for people that own condominiums in South Florida, Southwest Florida, the coastal communities in North Florida, a lot of those communities are obviously within the coast, and not only do they have more weather variations, but of course they're more influenced by hurricanes and such. So what does that mean for those type of homeowners? Well, what it means is they're supposed to undergo a very rigid inspection, which is supposed to basically detail what needs to be updated, improved, or safety hazards corrected. And so, especially for your older properties, which obviously this law pertains to, 30 years or older, so think about properties built before 1995, they very well have things that are needing updating, whether they've kind of reached the end of their useful life, they were built when the building codes were a lot lower, or they just haven't really been what I would call having TLC or been maintained as well as you would like. So how does that affect specifically individual condominium owners? Well, it can affect them very significantly, and I know there's been a lot of publicity about this from a financial point of view. So let's say you have a big complex. It's 3 stories or large or higher, I should say, and they were built 30 years or more ago. And so they get inspected by the state inspectors, and they come up with a variety of things that need to be implemented. and those things are quite expensive. And let's further state that possibly because they weren't budgeted for these type of repairs, the reserves are far short of where they need to be to correct these problems. Usually the inspectors, and I'm not an expert on this part, but they'll have some type of timeline where they expect these repairs to be taken. I'm sure they're going to have to give some of these complexes a fair amount of time, because you could be talking about a significant amount of expenditure for this. So if the required expenditures far exceed what's in reserves, what that means basically is that the existing condominium owners are going to get a significant assessment, and then they have to pay that assessment in order to fund these repairs or bringing them up to current standards. And so, like in that tragedy in South Florida, it was reported that two things occurred there. Number one, that a lot of those deficiencies they were aware of, but because they didn't have anywhere near the reserves, and the amount of the repairs involved would have put a huge financial hardship on a lot of the condominium owners, and possibly they couldn't have afforded to pay for it. So that would have created another set of major issues. Those things just kind of were overlooked, and unfortunately, the tragedy ensued by that. So when you're a condominium owner in a complex 30 years or older, your building management or your HOA directors, whoever is in charge of your financials, needs to become a lot more proactive and try to budget what these changes are going to involve financially to the condominium owners, and then try to decide how they're going to collect that money so that they're working toward having adequate reserves, if they don't already do that, before the inspection comes down with these particular guidelines and requirements. Now, this doesn't apply to buildings that are 2 stories. So there's a certain percentage of your condominium buildings that are only 2 stories, so they're exempt from that requirement. But if you're 3 stories or more, and you're of the age group that I mentioned, 30 years or older, then you have to adhere to these things. And then once you've had the initial inspection and you've brought the property up to code, the re-inspections will be done every 10 years. Now, for buildings that are not quite as old, for example, they reach 30 after December 31st, well, then they must be inspected by December 31st of the year they reach 30 years old. So, for example, I'll use as an example one of the areas that I do a lot of business in, and that's Hunters Creek. Hunters Creek has 4 condominium associations. To my knowledge, 3 of those are 3 stories. So they're going to qualify for these rules when they turn 30 years old. So these complexes that I feel are 3 stories were built in 1997, 1998, and 1999. So within the next 2 to 4 years, they're all going to fall under that 30-year guideline, and they're going to have to go through these inspections and then see what turns up financially. So it's definitely something that condominium owners need to be aware of, because that may influence where they buy, or if they're in an older community, are they deciding that maybe they can't afford to stay in that community because they're concerned about what the potential assessments are going to be, and so maybe they'll consider selling their unit. But in either event, if you're in a community that's going to turn 30 years old, that has 3 stories, and it's going to do that within the next 5 years, it's something you ought to be fully aware of as a condominium owner. And also, you ought to ask questions during your annual condominium meetings as to what the plan is from the people that are overseeing the reserve requirements. Have they reassessed their reserves and increased it where necessary so that it's not involving an undue financial hardship on the homeowners? So that's a little bit about that, and that's going to get more and more publicity when it starts impacting some of these Central Florida communities rather. Now, the other part of the condominium changes weren't really condominium changes per se, but were more for the HOAs in general. And so Florida enacted several new HOA laws in 2025. And basically, they focused on transparency, financial accountability, and homeowner protections. Some of these changes included enhanced disclosure requirements, stricter board member qualifications, and strengthened dispute resolution mechanisms. And the explanation of these changes were that they were aimed to improve the overall living experience in condominium and homeowners associations across the state of Florida. And for those of you that live in an HOA community, of which there are many, because in the Central Florida area, I would say the majority of communities have a homeowners association. We always think about paying dues, but what we don't always think about are what are the rules and regulations and how is that community being managed. And there's a wide variation. Some communities are well managed, others you hear horror stories about. The HOAs do have a lot of power, and people don't always realize that until they live in a community. I know myself over the years, I've gotten various potential buyers ask me, I'd like to buy a property in a non-HOA managed community. And that's easier said than done, because in what I call more of the suburban or Orlando proper area, it's a lot more difficult to find a home in a non-HOA controlled community. So for somebody that has that as a crucial component of their wish list, they may end up having to live a lot further out, more in a rural environment. Now, the reason for these rules is because some HOAs have abused their authority. You get people with a somewhat unfettered power, and they can make life miserable for a particular homeowner. On the flip side of that, if they're doing a good job, they're maintaining the community and keeping a high quality standard. And what that does, people enjoy living there because the community is well maintained. And also resale values usually are stronger in a well maintained HOA community. But that's kind of a tightrope. I know myself, again, I'll use Hunters Creek as an example because it's one of the biggest HOA communities in Central Florida, and it's pretty well known. They have some great things in Hunters Creek. They have a park system that's second to none. They have immaculate community landscaping. They have a lot of nature paths. So they have a lot of those things that a lot of the residents enjoy. They have a very detailed website, which is one of the new requirements, that all HOAs need to have a dedicated website so people can look up the rules and regulations. On the flip side, sometimes their enforcement of the rules is not always consistent or doesn't seem to be. You might get a violation letter for what you consider to be somewhat of a negligible requirement, and then you'll see neighbors on your street that maybe have something far worse relating to the same citing that you received. So you sometimes wonder, how are they determining who they're going to enforce these rules with? Now, one of the things that most of the big HOA communities do now, which is very frustrating for a lot of real estate brokers and homeowners, is what they call the estoppel requirement. So what an estoppel requirement is, you'll place a home under contract, so it's what they call the pending sale status. And so typically from the time it's pending to the time it closes may vary anywhere from a few weeks to a couple months. So within that time frame, the closing agent, which is typically a title company in Florida, as part of their due diligence and to make sure that the title is getting transferred to the new homeowner without any hidden or unforeseen issues or any problems whatsoever, they notify the HOA of a pending sale and when that sale is going to take place. So what a lot of these communities do is they'll send an inspector out to the property to verify that it's in compliance with the different rules and regulations that that neighborhood has. And they also have a fee to do that. So in most of these communities, the homeowner is probably going to pay somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $400 for what they call the estoppel, which involves inspecting their property and also letting the title company know if that particular homeowner has paid their dues up to date, etc. But I'll focus more on the inspection part of it. It's not uncommon that you'll get violations for the inspection. Now, I always have two questions as the realtor involved in the transaction, if it's my seller. Number one, had these sellers been notified previously that they had violations? If so, they should have told me this already, and hopefully they have. But let's say like I had a closing last week. So this is fresh on my mind, so this is why I'm going over this today. So that homeowner was cited with 3 cosmetic violations. One had to do with cleaning their roof. One had to do with trimming back a big tree. And one had to do with cleaning their driveway. So, those things are not that uncommon. The roof thing sometimes is subjective on, what's an acceptable looking roof, but I'm not going to really discuss that because that's an opinion. The driveway mainly deals with, I guess, from the homeowners association, if it's somewhat discolored. And obviously, usually when the trees are cited, it's usually an easement tree that may hang over either the sidewalk or the roadway, and they feel it's causing somewhat of a hazard. So this particular homeowner of mine happened to be a homeowner that used the property as a secondary property, so they weren't always here. But I did notify them of the violations, and they were going to be back in Florida before the closing, so they had enough time to correct those issues. So they did correct the issues, and I'd instructed them prior to correcting the issues, you know what date you're going to have the issues corrected, so let the homeowners association know the dates so they could come out and do the inspection right away so it wouldn't cause any last-minute drama with your property about, possibly a closing issue. So they did do that. They called the association. They had the property inspected on the 3 repairs but the 3 violations that they had corrected. And they hired all professional people to do this. They didn't self-correct any of these things, even though obviously they could have. And then I got a call at my office like 3 days before closing that they corrected the 3 violations, but they ended up creating 2 new violations from correcting the 3 violations. So you can imagine my initial reaction was not only surprise, but kind of aggravation, especially with the problems that they claim the correction cited. Anyway, to make a long story short, one of the corrections, the homeowner appealed, and they waived that, which they should have, because in my opinion, it was really a nitpicky thing. And then the other correction, which we weren't going to have time to do before closing, we ended up having to negotiate with the buyer and give them a financial credit and then the buyer would be responsible for correcting that issue after closing. So my biggest, I guess, pet peeve with this is that they're not always doing these inspections while the homeowner is living there. So when they get notified of a pending sale and they find violations, of course, obviously the homeowner is notified at that point. But I feel it's kind of like they've got the homeowner at a very big disadvantage. They know the homeowner's got a house under contract. They know the homeowner wants to sell. They know that they have a buyer that's got a firm closing date that's ready, willing, and able to purchase. And they know that either those items that they cite the homeowner for have to be corrected before closing and re-inspected, or the new homeowner has to accept the violations and be responsible for it after closing. In either event, it's kind of putting a lot of pressure on the homeowner. And it would be one thing if the homeowner had been notified of those violations previously and had ignored the notice. Then by all means they were given the proper notice and should have corrected it, and in this situation let me know as their agent. But if they haven't been notified before, then the question is, why were those defects overlooked, and why all of a sudden, now that the sale is pending, are they notifying the homeowner of those things? I just feel that's a little bit of an overreach, and it's using their authoritarian position to somewhat intimidate the seller and give the seller limited options. So that's where you could have some overreach by homeowners associations. And this is a potential in any community that has a homeowners association that has an estoppel requirement, because when they have an estoppel requirement, they usually require inspections. So you can say, oh, in my case, I'm kind of making a mountain out of a molehill, but if you're involved in that particular situation, there's enough stress and moving parts involved for the sale that you don't need unnecessary things. And to me, there should be a procedure in place where they can't cite the homeowner for a new violation if they haven't notified them previously. I feel strongly about that because in Hunters Creek, for example, they have community inspectors in every neighborhood. And even though Hunters Creek's big, if you passed a property and didn't see any blatant violations that you felt warranted a warning letter to that homeowner, then they shouldn't have gotten one after the estoppel. I just feel that's overreach. And in this particular case, to me, it was very frustrating. But anyway, the point of me explaining all these things about homeowners associations are you need to be aware of a homeowners association when you're thinking of purchasing in a community. And you should definitely review the association's guidelines to make sure that they're not going to be guidelines that you don't feel you can adhere to as a homeowner. So that's all for today. I hope everyone is dealing with the rain and hot weather. Have a great rest of the week, and we will see everybody with our Friday podcast. This is Marty Kaiser out.